Imagine trying to move a massive naval armada, including 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, across 3,000 miles of the most unforgiving, violent ocean on Earth. Now imagine doing it in the dead of winter, in absolute radio silence, without being spotted by a single civilian freighter or enemy patrol plane. In modern warfare, with satellite surveillance and over-the-horizon radar, such a feat is mathematically impossible. Yet, in the late autumn of 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy executed exactly this logistical miracle, setting the stage for 90 minutes of concentrated violence that would forever alter the trajectory of human history. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a tactical surprise, it was a masterclass in operational planning, force projection, and calculated risk. But it was also one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders ever committed by a modern nation-state. Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the Hollywood myths and analyze the cold, hard mechanics of warfare, focusing on the logistics, firepower, and tactical doctrines that decide the fate of empires. Before we tear into the schematics of the Japanese strike force and the American defensive posture, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. I want to know your thoughts on a critical question. Do you believe the United States Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii acted as a strategic deterrent, or did it merely serve as a concentrated, irresistible target for a resource-starved empire? To understand the explosive violence of December 7, we cannot simply start in 1941. We have to look at the geopolitical chessboard decades prior, because wars of this magnitude are never born overnight. They are the result of slow, grinding friction between opposing national interests. For Japan, the road to Pearl Harbor began with a desperate thirst for industrial autonomy. By the early 20th century, Japan had rapidly modernized, transforming from a feudal society into an industrialized military powerhouse. But geography had dealt them a terrible hand. The Japanese home islands were practically devoid of the raw materials required to feed a modern war machine. They lacked iron ore, rubber, scrap metal, and most importantly, they lacked oil. Without oil, battleships are just floating steel museums, and aircraft are nothing more than heavy aluminum paperweights. To secure these resources, Japan expanded aggressively into the Asian mainland, annexing Korea and eventually invading Manchuria and mainland China in the 1930s. This brutal expansionism put Tokyo on a direct collision course with the foreign policy of the United States. The United States, acting as the self-appointed guardian of the open-door policy in China, viewed Japanese aggression as a direct threat to American economic interests and regional stability in the Pacific. The American response was not initially military, but economic. Washington began tightening a logistical noose around Japan's neck. In 1940, the United States restricted the export of aviation motor fuels and high-grade scrap iron to Japan. But the fatal blow came in July 1941. Following the Japanese occupation of French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and enacted a total embargo on oil exports. At that moment, 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. This was not just a diplomatic sanction, it was an economic death sentence. Did the United States truly believe Japan would just quietly choke to death on an oil embargo, or did Washington know they were forcing Tokyo into a corner where violence was the only remaining option? When the oil was cut off, the Imperial Japanese Navy's logistical clock started ticking loudly. Japan possessed a strategic oil reserve of roughly 43 million barrels. Under peacetime conditions, this might last 3 years. But engaged in an active war in China, the Japanese military was burning through 12,000 tons of fuel a day. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, presented the grim mathematics to Emperor Hirohito. In less than 18 months, the Japanese fleet would be immobilized. Japan faced a binary choice. They could submit to American demands, withdraw from China, and accept a humiliating return to a second-rate power status. Or they could strike south to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, known today as Indonesia, and the rubber plantations of British Malaya. But structuring south meant exposing their eastern flank to the United States Pacific Fleet, which President Roosevelt had provocatively moved from San Diego, California, to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in 1940. This brings us to the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Yamamoto is often misunderstood by history. He was not a blind fanatic. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had seen the automobile factories of Detroit and the steel mills of Pennsylvania. He understood the terrifying, sleeping industrial capacity of the United States. Yamamoto vehemently opposed a war with America, knowing Japan could never win a protracted war of attrition. But once the political decision was made to go to war, Yamamoto's tactical genius took over. He understood a fundamental military truth: if you are forced into a cage fight with a heavyweight champion, you do not try to outbox him for 12 rounds. You hit him in the jaw with a tire iron before the bell even rings. Yamamoto's plan was radical. Traditional Japanese naval doctrine, known as Kantai Kessen or the decisive battle doctrine, dictated that the Japanese fleet should wait for the American fleet to cross the Pacific, whittling it down with submarines and destroyers, before destroying it in a massive battleship clash near the Japanese home islands. This was heavily influenced by their stunning victory over the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. But Yamamoto knew that waiting would allow the United States to leverage its industrial might. He proposed taking the fight directly to the enemy's heavily fortified base in Hawaii. This required projecting air power across an ocean, a concept that had never been attempted on this scale. To execute this, Japan assembled the Kido Butai, or mobile force, the most lethal concentration of naval aviation the world had ever seen. Commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the Kido Butai consisted of 6 fleet carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Combined, they carried a strike force of over 400 combat aircraft. Let us break down this aerial arsenal, because the specific engineering of these machines dictated the tactics of the attack. First was the Mitsubishi Ace M0, arguably the finest carrier-based fighter in the world in 1941. Powered by a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial engine producing roughly 900 horsepower, the Zero was incredibly maneuverable and had an astonishing range of over 1,900 miles. However, to achieve this performance, Japanese engineers sacrificed armor. The Zero had no armor plating for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. A few well-placed 50-caliber rounds could turn it into a fireball. The primary ship killers were the dive bombers and torpedo bombers. The Aichi D-3A, codenamed Val by the Allies, was a rugged dive bomber with fixed landing gear, capable of carrying a 550-pound armor-piercing bomb. But the true threat to the American battleships was the Nakajima B-5N, codenamed Kate. The Kate was tasked with delivering the Type 91 aerial torpedo. Here the Japanese faced a massive technical hurdle. The waters of Pearl Harbor were incredibly shallow, averaging only about 40 feet deep. A standard aerial torpedo, when dropped from a plane, would plunge 70 to 100 feet underwater before its internal gyroscopes leveled it out. In Pearl Harbor, standard torpedoes would just bury themselves in the harbor mud. How does a military force overcome a seemingly impossible geographic constraint? They look to history and they innovate. In November 1940, the British Royal Navy launched a daring carrier strike against the Italian fleet anchored at Taranto. The British Fairey Swordfish biplanes successfully dropped torpedoes in shallow water, crippling 3 Italian battleships. The Japanese studied Taranto obsessively. They realized the British had attached wooden breakaway fins to the tip of their torpedoes to stabilize them in flight and prevent them from diving too deep upon hitting the water. Japanese engineers refined this concept, crafting custom wooden fins for the Type 91 torpedoes and modifying the gyroscopes. They trained their Kate pilots relentlessly in Kagoshima Bay, which shared a similar topography to Pearl Harbor, forcing them to fly at a suicidal altitude of just 60 feet above the water before releasing their weapons. Now, let us look at the target, the United States Pacific Fleet and the defensive posture of the Hawaiian Department. The naval forces were under the command of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, while the Army defenses were commanded by Lieutenant General Walter C. Short. The American military in 1941 was in a state of rapid expansion, but it was suffering from a peacetime mentality. The United States possessed a staggering industrial advantage over Japan. In 1941, the U.S. produced over 70 million tons of steel, while Japan struggled to produce 6 million. The U.S. gross domestic product was 10 times larger than Japan's. Furthermore, Congress had passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act in 1940, authorizing a 70% expansion of the U.S. Navy. Yamamoto knew this massive armada of new ships would start hitting the water by 1943. Japan had a rapidly closing window of opportunity. Despite the looming threat, the defense of Pearl Harbor was fundamentally flawed due to a massive intelligence failure and a misreading of the enemy's capabilities. General Short, commanding the Army forces, believed the primary threat to his aircraft was not a Japanese carrier strike, but sabotage from the local Japanese-American population living in Hawaii. Consequently, he ordered his aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in the center of the airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows fields. He wanted them clustered together so they could be easily guarded by a small perimeter of sentries. Tactically, this made sense if you were fighting saboteurs with dynamite. But against a coordinated aerial strafing attack, Short had inadvertently created a bombardier's dream. Furthermore, the integration of new technology was abysmal. The United States had installed a cutting-edge SCR-270 radar system at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu. This radar could detect aircraft up to 150 miles away. However, the radar network was not fully operational 24 hours a day, and more importantly, it was not properly integrated into a centralized command and control center. The operators looking at the glowing cathode ray tubes had no direct, streamlined way to scramble fighter squadrons or alert the anti-aircraft batteries on the ships. You can have the most advanced sensors in the world, but if the data does not flow instantly to the trigger pullers, it is completely useless. As the calendar flipped to late November 1941, the diplomatic talks in Washington between U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Japanese ambassadors broke down completely. The Hull note, delivered on November 26, demanded a complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina. For Tokyo, this was an unacceptable ultimatum. That very same day, in the freezing, fog-shrouded waters of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, the Kido Butai weighed anchor. The 6 aircraft carriers, heavily laden with fuel and munitions, turned their bows eastward into the brutal North Pacific swells. They were embarking on a 4,000-mile journey across an empty, storm-tossed route specifically chosen to avoid merchant shipping lanes. The crews were ordered to throw their garbage into the ship's incinerators rather than overboard, lest sinks of trash give away their position. Radio transmitters were physically disabled to ensure absolute silence. The trap had been set, the hammer was pulled back, and a steel armada was silently closing the distance in the dark, carrying the spark that would ignite a global inferno. The physical reality of launching a massive aerial strike from the deck of an aircraft carrier in the North Pacific during the dead of winter is a brutal, violent mechanical ballet. At 6 in the morning on December 7, 1941, the 6 carriers of the Kido Butai were pitching violently in heavy swells, their flight decks slick with sea spray and freezing rain. Ground crews, fighting against gale force winds, manually muscled 183 aircraft into launching position for the first wave. The roar of hundreds of Nakajima and Mitsubishi radial engines warming up simultaneously created a deafening, vibrating wall of sound that shook the steel decks. Launching heavily laden bombers from a pitching deck requires absolute precision, where a miscalculation of a feet or a sudden drop of the ship's bow means plunging directly into the freezing ocean to be crushed under the carrier's keel. Yet, in just 15 minutes, the Japanese crews launched the entire first wave, without losing a single aircraft to the sea, an astonishing display of operational efficiency that remains a benchmark in naval aviation history. As Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led this massive aerial armada southward toward Oahu, we have to examine the specific ordnance they were carrying, because the tools of destruction dictate the geometry of the battlefield. The Japanese knew that standard aerial bombs would simply bounce off the heavily armored decks of American dreadnoughts. To solve this, Japanese ordnance engineers at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal engaged in a brilliant piece of improvisational engineering. They took obsolete 16-inch armor-piercing shells, originally designed to be fired from the massive guns of the Nagato-class battleships, and heavily modified them. They machined away the driving bands, welded on aerodynamic tail fins, and fitted them with delayed action fuses. The result was the Type 99, a massive 1,760-pound kinetic penetrator. The tactical doctrine for this weapon was simple but unforgiving. The Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers operating in a high-altitude bombing role had to drop these massive steel darts from as exact 10,000 feet. This specific altitude was mathematically calculated to allow the 1,700-pound shell to achieve terminal velocity, giving it the kinetic energy required to punch straight through 5 inches of hardened deck armor before the delayed fuse detonated the explosive charge deep inside the ship's vital spaces. This concept of using massive, gravity-driven kinetic penetrators to destroy heavily armored targets from above would later murder the British with their 12,000-pound tall boy bunker-busting bombs in Europe, and is the exact same physical principle used by modern American GBU-28 laser-guided penetrators today. While this lethal payload was closing the distance at 150 miles per hour, the American defensive apparatus had a fleeting golden opportunity to blunt the attack. At 7:02 in the morning, 2 Army privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were staring at the glowing green oscilloscope of the SCR-270 radar set at Opana Point. Suddenly, the largest radar echo they had ever seen spiked on the screen, indicating a massive formation of aircraft 132 miles out, approaching from the north. They immediately called the Centralized Information Center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, was a fighter pilot with almost no training in the newly established radar warning network. Knowing that a flight of American B-17 Flying Fortresses was scheduled to arrive from California that morning, Tyler uttered the now infamous words, "Do not worry about it." How does a modern military apparatus possess the cutting-edge technological capability to see over the horizon, yet entirely lack the institutional paranoia and streamlined command structure required to actually pull the alarm? The failure at Opana Point was not a failure of technology. It was a catastrophic failure of human doctrine, proving that data without rapid, intelligent analysis is completely worthless on the battlefield. At 7:48 in the morning, Fuchida looked down through the broken clouds and saw the entire United States Pacific Fleet sitting passively at anchor, totally unaware of the impending slaughter. He slid back the canopy of his Kate bomber and fired a single blue flare, signaling the attack. Moments later, his radio operator tapped out the Morse code signal, Tora, 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 indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The Japanese assault was a meticulously choreographed, dual-pronged strike designed to paralyze the Americans simultaneously. The first priority was establishing absolute air superiority. Dozens of A-6M0 fighters and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down out of the sun, targeting the American airfields at Wheeler, Hickam, and Bellows. This is where General Short's decision to park his aircraft wingtip to wingtip in the center of the tarmac turned from a peacetime security measure into a tactical nightmare. The Japanese pilots did not even need to aim at individual aircraft. They simply lined up their sights on the endless rows of parked P-40 Warhawks and P-36 Hawks, squeezing the triggers on their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns. The incendiary rounds tore through the aluminum skins and ignited the high-octane aviation fuel tanks. Because the planes were parked so closely together, the fire jumped from one fuselage to the next in a catastrophic chain reaction. In a matter of minutes, the core of American air power in Hawaii was reduced to a burning graveyard of twisted duralumin and melting rubber, guaranteeing that the Japanese bombers over the harbor would face almost no aerial opposition. Simultaneously, the most lethal element of the strike force, the torpedo bombers commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, began their attack run on Battleship Row. Dropping down to a suicidal altitude of just 60 feet above the water, flying at 160 knots, the Kate bombers approached the massive, stationary silhouettes of the American dreadnoughts. They released their specially modified Type 91 torpedoes with the wooden breakaway fins. The engineering modifications worked flawlessly. The torpedoes hit the water, the wooden fins snapped off, and the weapons stabilized just below the surface, streaking toward the steel hulls at 40 knots. The USS Oklahoma, a 27,000-ton Nevada-class battleship, was moored outboard, making her a massive unshielded target. She absorbed a horrific beating, taking up to 9 torpedo hits on her port side in a matter of minutes. The physical mechanics of what happened next are terrifying. Battleships are designed with anti-torpedo ballistas, external compartments meant to absorb the shockwave of an underwater detonation. But the Japanese torpedoes hit in such rapid succession, often striking the exact same gaping holes left by previous impacts, that they completely bypassed the defensive blisters and detonated deep inside the ship's lower hull. Thousands of tons of seawater rushed into the port-side compartments at incredible pressure. The massive ship immediately began to list heavily. As the list increased, water poured into the lower deck hatches, accelerating the disaster. In just 12 agonizing minutes, the massive dreadnought completely capsized, rolling over until her masts jammed into the harbor mud, trapping over 400 American sailors in the pitched, black, rapidly flooding compartments of her overturned hull. But the most iconic and devastating moment of the entire attack occurred at 8:06 in the morning, involving the high-altitude bombers carrying those modified 16-inch armor-piercing shells. A formation of Kates passed over the USS Arizona, dropping their 1,700-pound kinetic penetrators. One of these massive steel darts struck the Arizona perfectly, penetrating the wooden deck just forward of turret number 2. The shell smashed down through 4 layers of hardened steel decks before its delayed fuse detonated inside the forward aviation fuel storage area. The resulting explosion ignited the adjacent black powder magazine, which was holding over 1 million pounds of smokeless gunpowder for the ship's massive 14-inch guns. The physical reality of 1 million pounds of ordnance detonating simultaneously inside a sealed steel container is beyond human comprehension. The explosion instantly vaporized the forward half of the 39,000-ton battleship. A massive fireball erupted over 500 feet into the air, creating a shockwave so powerful it literally blew men off the decks of neighboring ships and snuffed out fires on adjacent vessels. The Arizona was instantly transformed into a burning, sinking tomb, taking 1,170 vast officers and crewmen down with her in a fraction of a second. This catastrophic magazine detonation is eerily identical to the fate of the British battlecruiser HMS Hood, which was vaporized by a plunging shell from the German battleship Bismarck just 6 months prior in May 1941, or the tragic explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898 that dragged America into the Spanish-American War. When heavy plunging armor-piercing ordnance meets a kinetic penetrator capable of finding the powder room, the resulting physics are brutally unforgiving and mathematically absolute. By 8:50 in the morning, the first wave was withdrawing, but the sky was already filling with the 171 aircraft of the second wave, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. However, the tactical environment had drastically changed. The element of surprise was completely gone. The American military, recovering from the initial shock, was fighting back with a ferocious, chaotic intensity. The sky over Pearl Harbor turned into a black, toxic soup of exploding 5-inch anti-aircraft flak, tracers, and thick black smoke pouring from the burning oil of the sunken ships. Sailors, many still in their underwear, were manually cutting the fuses on anti-aircraft shells and physically hauling heavy ammunition boxes up ladders to feed the hungry guns. During this second wave, the Japanese pilots spotted a high-value target on the move. The USS Nevada, despite having a gaping torpedo hole in her bow, had managed to build up steam and cast off her mooring lines. She was the only battleship to get underway during the attack, slowly moving down the channel toward the open sea. The Japanese dive bomber pilots immediately recognized a massive tactical opportunity. If they could concentrate their heavy bombs on the Nevada and sink her in the narrowest part of the harbor entrance, her 29,000-ton carcass would act as a massive steel plug. This would bottle up the entire surviving Pacific fleet inside the harbor for months, rendering them strategically useless. This tactic of intentionally sinking ships to block a strategic waterway is a classic naval maneuver, heavily reminiscent of the British attempt to sink block ships at Zeebrugge in 1918 to trap German U-boats, or the American sinking of the USS Merrimack to block the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor. Realizing the Japanese strategy as a swarm of Val dive bombers descended upon him, the Nevada's commanding officer made a brilliant split-second tactical decision. He intentionally ran his massive battleship aground at Hospital Point, beaching the vessel in shallow water to ensure the vital channel remained clear, absorbing a brutal pounding of bomb hits, but saving the strategic integrity of the harbor. By 10 in the morning, exactly 90 minutes after the first bomb dropped, the sky over Oahu suddenly grew quiet, replaced by the crackle of massive oil fires and the screams of the wounded. The Japanese strike force was turning north, heading back to the Kido Butai. They left behind a scene of apocalyptic devastation. 2,403 Americans were dead. 19 U.S. Navy ships, including 8 irreplaceable battleships, were sunk or severely damaged. Over 300 American aircraft were destroyed or crippled. It was a tactical masterpiece, an aerial ambush executed with terrifying precision that seemingly validated Yamamoto's radical plan. But as Vice Admiral Nagumo paced the bridge of the flagship Akagi, listening to the ecstatic reports of his returning pilots, he was weighing the tactical risk of a counterattack against the strategic reward of total annihilation, and he was about to make a conservative command decision that would ultimately doom the entire Japanese empire. As Vice Admiral Nagumo paced the enclosed bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, he was presented with a furious demand from his most aggressive air commanders, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida and Commander Minoru Genda. They pleaded for a third wave, arguing that the American fighters were grounded, the anti-aircraft batteries were low on ammunition, and the sky belonged entirely to the Imperial Japanese Navy. But Nagumo was a product of the old guard, a surface warfare officer who viewed aircraft carriers as fragile support vessels, rather than the main battery of the fleet. He looked at the tactical board and saw unacceptable risks. The 3 American aircraft carriers known to be attached to the Pacific Fleet were nowhere to be found in the harbor, meaning they were somewhere out in the open ocean, potentially flanking the Japanese strike force. Furthermore, Nagumo knew his fleet was operating at the absolute razor edge of its logistical tether, low on fuel and vulnerable to land-based bombers if he lingered too long. He made the conservative, mathematically safe decision to turn his fleet around and head back to the freezing waters of the North Pacific. In doing so, he snatched strategic defeat from the jaws of a stunning tactical victory. Why was the cancellation of the third wave the ultimate fatal flaw of the entire Pearl Harbor operation? Because in modern warfare, killing the enemy's frontline combatants is only half the battle. If you want to paralyze a modern military, you do not just sink its ships, you destroy its ability to refuel, repair, and sustain those ships. The first 2 Japanese waves had focused almost entirely on the battleships and the airfields, the glamorous high-profile targets. But sitting completely exposed, untouched by a single bomb, were the mundane, logistical targets that actually kept the Pacific Fleet alive. Just above the harbors sat the massive unarmored, above-ground oil tank farms, holding a staggered 4.5 million barrels of heavy fuel oil. A single flight of Zeros strafing those tanks with incendiary rounds could have turned the entire stockpile into a raging inferno, depriving the U.S. Navy of the fuel required to operate in the Pacific. Similarly, the Japanese completely ignored the submarine pens and the massive dry docks, including Dry Dock Number 1, which was the only facility in the Central Pacific capable of repairing a heavily damaged capital ship. We can see the exact same strategic blindness in other major conflicts throughout military history. Consider the Battle of Britain in 1940, when the German Luftwaffe had the British Royal Air Force on the ropes by relentlessly bombing their radar stations and fighter airfields. But just as the British logistical and command network was about to collapse, Hermann Göring inexplicably shifted the Luftwaffe's focus to bombing the civilian population of London. This terror tactic gave the Royal Air Force the breathing room it desperately needed to repair its airfields, rebuild its fighter squadrons, and ultimately win the battle. We can also look back to the American Civil War and Union General George McClellan during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. McClellan possessed overwhelming numerical and material superiority, but his constant fear of phantom enemy reinforcements led him to make overly cautious, conservative decisions, allowing the Confederate Army to survive and prolong the war for 3 more bloody years. Nagumo suffered from the same crippling caution as McClellan and the same poor target prioritization as Goring. By leaving the oil tanks, the submarine pens, and the machine shops intact, Nagumo ensured that Pearl Harbor remained a fully functional forward operating base. Had he destroyed that infrastructure, Admiral Chester Nimitz later admitted, the United States Pacific Fleet would have been forced to retreat 2,000 miles back to San Diego, delaying any American offensive operations in the Pacific by at least 2 years. But the survival of the logistics base was not the only stroke of catastrophic bad luck for the Japanese Empire. The entire premise of the Pearl Harbor attack was rooted in the outdated doctrine that battleships were the undisputed kings of the seas. Yamamoto and Nagumo wanted to break the spine of the American battle line, and they did. But the spine of the fleet was already obsolete. The 3 American aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga, were completely absent from the carnage. The Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway Island. The Enterprise, under the command of the aggressive Vice Admiral William Halsey, was returning from delivering fighter planes to Wake Island and was delayed by a storm. The Saratoga was safely docked on the California coast. By sinking the slow, lumbering battleships, the Japanese inadvertently forced the United States Navy to completely rewrite its tactical playbook overnight. The Americans had no choice but to build their entire Pacific strategy around the Fast Carrier Task Force, a doctrine that relied on speed, over-the-horizon strikes, and massive superiority. The Japanese did not destroy the American fleet. They merely forcefully modernized it, stripping away the old dead weight and leaving only the lethal aviation-centric core that would eventually hunt down and sink every single carrier of the Kido Butai. Beyond the tactical and logistical blunders, we have to examine the colossal intelligence and political machinations that occurred behind the scenes. How did the United States, possessing the most robust economy in the world, get caught completely flat-footed? The truth is, American intelligence was actively intercepting and decoding top-secret Japanese diplomatic traffic. Cryptanalysts in Washington, operating under the code name Magic, had broken the Japanese purple cipher. In the days leading up to the attack, they intercepted a 14-part message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, effectively breaking off all diplomatic relations. The final part of the message was decoded on the morning of December 7. However, the American intelligence apparatus in 1941 was a disjointed, bureaucratic mess. There was no centralized agency like the modern CIA or NSA to filter the noise, analyze the raw data, and push actionable intelligence to the battlefield commanders. The critical warning message to General Short and Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii was not sent via a secure, dedicated military hotline. It was sent via Western Union commercial telegraph. By the time the bicycle messenger delivered the telegram to the command headquarters, the bombs had already been falling for hours. You can crack every code in the enemy's playbook, but if your command structure is too bogged down in red tape to relay the warning, your intelligence is completely useless. But the most profound miscalculation made by the Japanese high command was psychological and economic. The military oligarchy in Tokyo fundamentally misunderstood the American character. They believed the United States was a soft, decadent isolationist nation that lacked the stomach for a brutal, high-casualty war. They assumed that a massive, bloody punch to the mouth at Pearl Harbor would shock the American public into demanding a negotiated peace, allowing Japan to secure its empire in Asia without interference. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The sneak attack on a Sunday morning, executed while Japanese diplomats were still officially negotiating peace in Washington, ignited a level of unified white-hot fury in the American populace that had not been seen since the bombardment of Fort Sumter or the massacre at the Alamo. Just as the Alamo transformed a localized Texan rebellion into a relentless, vengeful crusade against Santa Anna, Pearl Harbor instantly vaporized the powerful American isolationist movement. Overnight, millions of young men flooded recruiting stations, and a divided, politically fractured nation was welded together by a single, unyielding purpose: the absolute destruction of the Japanese Empire. This psychological mobilization unleashed the most terrifying weapon on the planet, the American industrial base. When Admiral Yamamoto allegedly warned that he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve, He was speaking about the mathematics of industrial production. Japan's economy was already redlining just to sustain its war in China. In contrast, the United States economy had vast, untapped reserves of manpower, raw materials, and manufacturing capacity. The transition to a total war economy was staggering. Automobile factories in Detroit stopped making civilian sedans and began churning out M4 Sherman tanks and aircraft engines. Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan was eventually producing a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. Shipyards utilizing prefabricated sections began launching Liberty ships in a matter of weeks, completely overwhelming the Japanese submarine fleet's ability to sink them. To put the economic disparity into perspective, between 1941 and 1945, the Japanese Empire managed to build 17 aircraft carriers of all types. In that exact same time frame, the United States built 141 aircraft carriers. It was a war of industrial attrition that Japan never had a mathematical chance of winning. In the final analysis, the 90 minutes of terror over Pearl Harbor stands as one of the most brilliant tactical achievements and one of the most catastrophic strategic failures in the history of human conflict. The Japanese strike force executed a logistical miracle, crossing an ocean in silence to deliver a devastating preemptive blow. They proved that naval aviation was the new supreme currency of war, rendering the heavily armored battleship obsolete in a single morning. But by failing to destroy the vital infrastructure that sustained the fleet, by missing the American aircraft carriers, and by infuriating a nation with 10 times their industrial capacity, the Japanese military effectively signed its own death warrant. The bombs that fell on Battleship Oro did not secure the Japanese empire. They merely started a 4-year countdown to the atomic fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War is never just about who strikes first or who possesses the most daring tactical plan. It is ultimately a brutal equation of logistics, industrial endurance, and the national willpower to absorb catastrophic damage and strike back. The United States took the heaviest blow it had ever received, staggered, bled, and then slowly stood up, transforming its economy into an unstoppable machine of mechanized violence. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive into the mechanics and the madness of Pearl Harbor. If you want to continue exploring the harsh realities of military history, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this video. Now I want to hear from you in the comment section below. If Admiral Nagumo had launched the third wave to destroy the oil reserves and dry docks, how would it have changed the war? A. It would have forced the U.S. to sue for peace. B. It would have delayed the U.S. counter-offensive by at least 2 years. Or C. It would have made no difference against American industrial might. Drop your answer and your reasoning below, and I will see you on the next battlefield.